These Small Hours with Russell Cordell Staker. Hi, friends. It's nice to have you back. This is These Small Hours podcast, and I am Russell Cordell Staker. This evening's production is the 9th, and I've titled this The Unknown Trumpeter, Mark Twain and the Crossing of the Rubicon. I came across an essay that was published a long time ago that I don't think was technically intended when Mark Twain wrote it as a true essay. It was really a letter that he wrote in response to the magazine Harper's Bazaar, in which there was some kind of context where the magazine in 1910 had asked or invited several writers to respond to some certain aspect of life, I guess. I'm not quite clear what that was, but this was Mark Twain's response, and he titled it The Turning Point of My Life, which was later published as the essay that it remains to this day. What's interesting is he wrote this, I think, a month or two before he died in 1910. He died on April 21, 1910, in Stormfield House in Redding, Connecticut. He was 74 years old. And to go back to the beginning of his life, he was born on November 30, 1835 in Florida, Missouri. What's interesting about Twain, just a little anecdote that I knew clear back when I was in high school, actually. I had a high school English teacher, Miss Otis, at Cherry Creek High School, and really loved her. She was an older woman, I think right at the end of her teaching career. But I remember one afternoon she shared this little anecdote, and I corroborated this on Wikipedia, by the way, but Twain was born shortly after an appearance of Halley's Comet, and he predicted that he would go out with it. Those were his words. And that's in fact what happened, because the day after Halley's Comet returned and made its closest approach to Earth, Mark Twain checked out of the building. So a little interesting side note. But anyway, back to what I was going to say here. So he wrote this I guess I'm going to define it as an open letter, but it's an essay, and it's entitled The Turning Point of My Life, right at the end of his life. And it's really refreshing what he's going to offer. I'm actually going to read that. And then I've got a few insights that I discovered for myself that I really just got my brain moving in a really cool direction. So that's really what this production is going to be about tonight. Before I read it, though, I'm just looking at my notes. I think it was William Faulkner, if I remember correctly. I'm going off the top of my head here. That said that he called Mark Twain the father of American literature. And, even if I wouldn't have read that or been aware that William Faulkner had said that, in my mind, I've often felt that Mark Twain is not only an American writer, I think he's probably the penultimate, the truest real American writer, next to maybe Walt Whitman and Frederick Douglass, beyond any other American writer. Mark Twain embodies so much of the old version, the old school of, and when I mean old school, I'm talking way back at the founding of America, all the way up into the present moment. He's juxtaposed right in that perfect spot in the middle that offers a really good texture to, I think, all the good things of Americanism. And his wit, he was a writer, he was a humorist, he was a lecturer. For me, Mark Twain, above all else, and it was his essays that I find much more enlightening than even his novels. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Innocents Abroad, to name a few of the books that he wrote. Those are all marvelous works, but it's his essays that really bring out this great irony and nuance. And those were the true, clear graces in the harmony, or the very harmony of his voice, that as a reader, I not only continue to keep coming back to, but I find just extreme pleasure in. And it's that irony that comes out. Some people will say, well, he's sarcastic. I think that's too hard of a word. I find him ironic. And, he challenges everything that he writes. He turns things upside down, and he gives you an angle that challenges your own bias. And that's what a great writer can do. And he does it because his heart's actually in the right place. Some people have even said that, what he wrote in some of his books was racist. And that's actually not the case. Mark Twain was very much on the side of equal rights and broad humanity in America. And what he did was he poked at the aspect of the stain of America, which is racism. And as we've seen, very most recently in the current modern day, it's a terrible blight upon this American land. And Mark Twain, even when he was writing, was aware of the fact that this was a stain that, it wasn't just going to be gotten rid of. It's something that we have to keep addressing until it's completely eradicated. So I'm kind of getting off on the side here, but what I really love about it is the fact that he challenges. And this essay is him looking back, or this letter of him looking back at his life and talking about the finer points of what his life provided for him and what was most important. So I'm going to go ahead and read that. And then I've got some things that I want to bring up after I'm done reading it. So without further ado, let me go ahead and get started on reading his essay entitled The Turning Point of My Life by Mark Twain. And this was, as I'd mentioned, written in 1910. 1. If I understand the idea the bizarre invites several of us to write upon the above text, it means the change in my life's course, which introduced what must be regarded by me as the most important condition of my career. But it also implies, without intention perhaps, that the turning point itself was the creator of the new condition. This gives it too much distinction, too much prominence, too much credit. It is only the last link in a very long chain of turning points commissioned to produce the cardinal result. It is not any more important than the humblest of its 10,000 predecessors. Each of the 10,000 did its appointed share on its appointed date in forwarding the scheme, and they were all necessary. To have left out any one of them would have defeated the scheme and brought about some other result. I know we have a fashion of saying such and such an event was the turning point of my life, but we shouldn't say it. We should merely grant that its place as last link in the chain makes it the most conspicuous link. In real importance, it is no advantage over any other of its predecessors, or it has no advantage over any one of its predecessors. Perhaps the most celebrated turning point recorded in history was the crossing of the Rubicon. Suetonius says, coming up with his troops on the banks of the Rubicon, he halted for a while, and revolving in his mind the importance of the step he was on the point of taking, he turned to those about him and said, "We may still retreat, but if we pass this little bridge, nothing is left for us but to fight out in arms," or to fight it out in arms. This was a stupendously important moment, and all the incidents, big and little, of Caesar's previous life had been leading up to it, stage by stage, link by link. This was the last link, merely the last one, and no bigger than the others. But as we gaze back at it through the inflating mists of our imagination, it looks as big as the orbit of Neptune. You, the reader, have a personal interest in that link, and so have I. So has the rest of the human race. It was one of the links in your life chain, and it was one of the links in mine. We may wait now with bated breath while Caesar reflects. Your fate and mine are involved in his decision. While he was thus hesitating, the following incident occurred. A person remarked for his noble mien and graceful aspect appeared close at hand, sitting and playing upon a pipe, when not only the shepherds, but a number of soldiers also flocked to listen to him, and some trumpeters among them. He snatched a trumpet from one of them, ran to the river with it, and sounding the advance with a piercing blast, crossed to the other side. Upon this, Caesar exclaimed, "Let us go whither the omens of the gods and the iniquity of our enemies call us. The die is cast." So he crossed, and changed the future of the whole human race for all time. But that stranger was a link in Caesar's life chain too, and a necessary one. We don't know his name. We never hear of him again. He was very casual. He acts like an accident, but he was no accident. He was there by compulsion of his life chain, to blow the electrifying blast that was to make up Caesar's mind for him, and thence go piping down the aisles of history forever. If the stranger hadn't been there, but he was, and Caesar crossed with such results, such vast events, each a link in the human race's life chain, each event producing the next one, and that one the next one, and so on, the destruction of the Republic, the founding of the empire, the breaking up of the empire, the rise of Christianity upon its ruins, the spread of the religion to other lands, and so on, link by link, took its appointed place at its appointed time, the discovery of America being one of them, our revolution another, the inflow of English and other immigrants another, their drift westward, my ancestors among them another, the settlement of certain of them in Missouri, which resulted in me, for I was one of the unavoidable results of the crossing of the Rubicon. If the stranger with his trumpet blast had stayed away, which he couldn't, for he was an appointed link, Caesar would not have crossed. What would have happened in that case, we can never guess. We only know that the things that did happen would not have happened. They might not have been replaced by equally prodigious things, of course, but their nature and results are beyond our guessing. But the matter that interests me personally is that I would not be here now, but somewhere else, and probably black. There is no telling. Very well. I'm glad he crossed, and very really and thankfully glad too, though I never cared anything about it before. 2. To me, the most important feature of my life is its literary feature. I've been professionally literary something more than 40 years. There have been many turning points in my life, but the one that was the last link in the chain appointed to conduct me to the Literary Guild is the most conspicuous link in that chain, because it was the last one. It was not any more important than its predecessors. All the other links have an inconspicuous look, except the crossing of the Rubicon, but as factors in making me literary, they are all the one size, the crossing of the Rubicon included, or they are all of one size. I know how I came to be literary, and I will tell the steps that led up to it and brought it about. The crossing of the Rubicon was not the first one. It was hardly even a recent one. I should have to go back ages before Caesar's day to find that first one. To save space, I will go back only a couple of generations and start with an incident of my boyhood. When I was 12 and a half years old, my father died. It was in the spring. The summer came and brought with it an epidemic of measles. For a time, a child died almost every day. The village was paralyzed with fright, distress, despair. Children that were not smitten with the disease were imprisoned in their homes to save them from the infection. In the homes, there were no cheerful faces, there was no music, there was no singing but of solemn hymns, no voice but of prayer. No romping was allowed, no noise, no laughter. The family moved spectrally about on tiptoe in a ghostly hush. I was a prisoner. My soul was steeped in this awful dreariness and in fear. At some time or other, every day and every night, a sudden shiver shook me to the marrow, and I said to myself, "There, I've got it, and I shall die. Life on these miserable terms is not worth living." And at last I made up my mind to get the disease and have it over, one way or the other. I escaped from the house and went to the house of a neighbor, where a playmate of mine was very ill with the malady. When the chance offered, I crept into his room and got into bed with him. I was discovered by his mother and sent back into captivity. But I had the disease. They could not take that from me. I came near to dying. The whole village was interested and anxious and sent news for me every day. And not only once a day, but several times. Everybody believed I would die, but on the 14th day, a change came for the worse, and they were disappointed. This was a turning point in my life, link number 1. For when I got well, my mother closed my school career and apprenticed me to a printer. She was tired of trying to keep me out of mischief, and the adventure of the measles decided her to put me into more masterful hands than hers. I became a printer and began to add one link after another to the chain which was to lead me into the literary profession. A long road, but I could not know that. And as I did not know what its goal was, or even that it had one, I was indifferent, also contented. A young printer wanders around a good deal, seeking and finding work, and seeking again when necessity commands. NB necessity is a circumstance. Circumstance is man's master, and when circumstance commands, he must obey. He may argue the matter that it is his privilege, just as it is the honorable privilege of a falling body to argue with the attraction of gravitation, but it won't do any good. He must obey. I wandered for 10 years under the guidance and dictatorship of circumstance, and finally arrived in a city of Iowa, where I worked several months. Among the books that interested me in those days was one about the Amazon. The traveler told an alluring tale of his long voyage up the great river from Para to the sources of the Madeira, through the heart of an enchanted land, a land wastefully rich in tropical wonders, a romantic land where all the birds and flowers and animals were of the museum varieties, and where the alligator and the crocodile and the monkey seemed as much at home as if they were in the zoo. Also, he told an astonishing tale about cocoa, a vegetable product of miraculous powers, asserting that it was so nourishing and so strength-giving that the native of the mountains of the Madeira, or the natives' region, would tramp uphill and down all day on just a pinch of powdered cocoa and require no other sustenance. I was fired with a longing to ascend the Amazon, also with a longing to open up a trade in cocoa with all the world. During months I dreamed that dream and tried to contrive ways to get to Para and spring that splendid enterprise upon an unsuspecting planet. But all in vain. A person may plan as much as he wants to, but nothing of consequence is likely to come of it until the magician circumstance steps in and takes the matter off his hands. At last, circumstance came to my help. It was in this way. Circumstance to help or hurt another man made him lose a $50 bill in the street, and to help or hurt me made me find it. I advertised the find and left for the Amazon the same day. This was another turning point, another link. Could circumstance have ordered another dweller in that town to go to the Amazon and open up a world trade in cocoa on a $50 basis and been obeyed? No, I was the only one. There were other fools there, shoals and shoals of them, but they were not of my kind. I was the only one of my kind. Circumstance is powerful, but it cannot work alone. It has to have a partner. Its partner is man's temperament, his natural disposition. His temperament is not his invention. It is born in him, and he has no authority over it. Neither is he responsible for its acts. He cannot change it. Nothing can change it. Nothing can modify it except temporarily, but it won't stay modified. It is permanent, like the color of the man's eyes and the shape of his ears. Blue eyes are gray in certain unusual lights, but they resume their natural color when that stress is removed. A circumstance that will coerce one man will have no effect upon a man of a different temperament. If circumstance had thrown the banknote in Caesar's way, his temperament would not have made him start for the Amazon. His temperament would have compelled him to do something with the money, but not that. It might have made him advertise the note and wait. We can't tell. Also, it might have made him go to New York and buy into the government, with results that would leave Tweed nothing to learn when it came to his turn. Very well. Circumstance furnished the capital, and my temperament told me what to do with it. Sometimes a temperament is an ass. When that is the case, the owner of it is an ass too, and is going to remain one. Training, experience, association can temporarily so polish him, improve him, exalt him that people will think he is a mule, but they will be mistaken. Artificially, he is a mule for the time being, but at the bottom, he is an ass yet and will remain one. By temperament, I was the kind of person that does things, does them and reflects afterward. So I started from the Amazon without reflecting and without asking any questions. That was more than 50 years ago. In all that time, my temperament has not changed by even a shade. I've been punished many a time and bitterly for doing things and reflecting afterward, but these tortures have been of no value to me. I still do the thing commanded by circumstance and temperament, and reflect afterward. Always violently. When I'm reflecting on those occasions, even deaf persons can hear me think. I went by the way of Cincinnati and down the Ohio and Mississippi. My idea was to take ship at New Orleans for Para. In New Orleans, I inquired and found there was no ship leaving for Para. Also that there never had been one leaving for Para. I reflected. A policeman came and asked me what I was doing, and I told him. He made me move on and said if he caught me reflecting in the public street again, he would run me in. After a few days, I was out of money. Then circumstance arrived with another turning point of my life, a new link. On my way down, I had made the acquaintance of a pilot. I begged him to teach me the river, and he consented. I became a pilot. By and by, circumstance came again, introducing the Civil War this time, in order to push me ahead another stage or two toward the literary profession. The boat stopped running. My livelihood was gone. Circumstance came to the rescue with a new turning point and a fresh link. My brother was appointed secretary to the new territory of Nevada, and he invited me to go with him and help him in his office. I accepted. In Nevada, circumstance furnished me the silver fever, and I went into the mines to make a fortune, as I supposed, but that was not the idea. The idea was to advance me in another step toward literature. For amusement, I scribbled things for the Virginia City Enterprise. One isn't a printer 10 years without setting up acres of good and bad literature and learning, unconsciously at first, consciously later, to discriminate between the two within his mental limitations. And meantime, he is unconsciously acquiring what is called a style. One of my efforts attracted attention, and the Enterprise sent for me and put me on its staff. And so I became a journalist, another link. By and by, circumstance and the Sacramento Union sent me to the Sandwich Islands for 5 or 6 months to write up sugar. I did it and threw in a good deal of extraneous matter that hadn't anything to do with sugar, but it was this extraneous matter that helped me to another link. It made me notorious, and San Francisco invited me to lecture, which I did, and profitably. I had long had a desire to travel and see the world, and now circumstance had most kindly and unexpectedly hurled me upon the platform and furnished me the means, so I joined the Quaker City excursion. When I returned to America, circumstance was waiting on the pier. With the last link, the conspicuous, the consummating, the victorious link, I was asked to write a book. And I did it, and called it The Innocents Abroad. Thus, I became at last a member of the Literary Guild. That was 42 years ago, and I've been a member ever since. Leaving the Rubicon incident away back where it belongs, I can say with truth that the reason I am in the literary profession is because I had the measles when I was 12 years old. 3. Now, what interests me as regards these details is not the details themselves, but the fact that none of them was foreseen by me. None of them was planned by me. I was the author of none of them. Circumstance, working in harness with my temperament, created them all and compelled them all. I often offered help and with the best intentions, but it was rejected, as a rule, uncourteously. I could never plan a thing and get it to come out the way I planned it. It came out some other way, some way I had not counted upon. And so I do not admire the human being as an intellectual marvel as much as I did when I was young and got him out of books and did not know him personally. When I used to read that such and such a general did a certain brilliant thing, I actually believed it. And I'm going to just say right now, I added the word actually, so sorry, Mr. Twain, he did not use actually there. Whereas it was not so. Circumstance did it by help of his temperament. The circumstance would have failed of effect with a general of another temperament. He might see the chance, but lose the advantage by being by nature too slow, or too quick, or too doubtful. Once General Grant was asked a question about a matter which had been much debated by the public in the newspapers. He answered the question without any hesitancy. "General, who planned the march through Georgia?" "The enemy." He added that the enemy usually makes your plans for you. He meant that the enemy, by neglect or through force of circumstances, leaves an opening for you, and you see your chance and take advantage of it. Circumstances do the planning for us all, no doubt, by help of our temperaments. I see no great difference between a man and a watch, except that the man is conscious and the watch isn't, and the man tries to plan things and the watch doesn't. The watch doesn't wind itself and doesn't regulate itself. These things are done exteriorly. Outside influences, outside circumstances, wind or wind the man and regulate him. Left to himself, he wouldn't get regulated at all, and the sort of time he would keep would not be valuable. Some rare men are wonderful watches with gold case, compensation balance, and all those things, and some men are only simple and sweet and humble waterberries. I am a waterberry of that kind, some say. A nation is only an individual multiplied. It makes plans and circumstance comes and upsets them or enlarges them. Some patriots throw the tea overboard. Some other patriots destroy a Bastille. The plans stop there. Then circumstance comes in quite unexpectedly and turns these modest riots into a revolution. And there was poor Columbus. He elaborated a deep plan to find a new route to an old country. Circumstance revised his plan for him, and he found a new world. And he gets the credit of it to this day. He hadn't anything to do with it. Necessarily the scene of the real turning point of my life and of yours was the Garden of Eden. It was there that the first link was forged of the chain that was ultimately to lead to the emptying of me into the Literary Guild. Adam's temperament was the first command the deity ever issued to a human being on this planet, and it was the only command Adam would never be able to disobey. It said, "Be weak, be water, be characterless, be cheaply persuadable." The later command to let the fruit alone was certain to be disobeyed, not by Adam himself, but by his temperament, which he did not create and had no authority over. For the temperament is the man. The thing tricked out with clothes and named man is merely its shadow, nothing more. The law of the tiger's temperament is, "Thou shalt kill." The law of the sheep's temperament is, "Thou shalt not kill." To issue later commands requiring the tiger to let the fat stranger alone and requiring the sheep to imbue its hands in the blood of the lion is not worthwhile, for those commands can't be obeyed. They would invite the violations of the law of temperament, which is supreme and takes precedence of all other authorities. I cannot help feeling disappointed in Adam and Eve, that is, in their temperaments, not in them, poor helpless young creatures, afflicted with temperaments made out of butter, which butter was commanded to get into contact with fire and be melted. What I cannot help wishing is that Adam and Eve had been postponed, and Martin Luther and Joan of Arc put in their place, that splendid pair equipped with temperaments not made of butter, but of asbestos. By neither sugary persuasions nor by hellfire should Satan have beguiled them to eat the apple. There would have been results, indeed, yes. The apple would be intact today. There would be no human race. There would be no you. There would be no me. And the old creation dawn scheme of ultimately launching me into the Literary Guild would have been defeated. Mark Twain, 1910. I can't help but read Twain and just laugh out loud. And I was doing my best as I was reading that again. I've read that, I don't know, a handful of times, and it just gets funnier every time I read it. And I just love his wit, his candor, and he really just gets right into the heart of things very quickly. The thing about Twain that always amazes me is that you can read a sentence or two, and by the time you're through a paragraph, you don't realize it. It's very subtle, but you're in very deep water, and he takes you there directly. And I think he takes great joy in the fact that he's taken you into deep water, and he's not sure if you can swim, and he's going to just put you there anyway, and you got to figure that out. But just a marvelous man. As most of us know, Mark Twain's real name was Samuel Langhorne Clemens, and he rests today in Woodlawn Cemetery in Elmira, New York. He's definitely on my radar for someday paying my respects. I would love to go out there and visit his gravesite. So I'm going to go back now. So I came across this essay again. It's in a book, an anthology that I've had for many, many years, a book that I bought at a secondhand bookstore in Indianapolis, Indiana, a long time ago. But anyway, the first time I read this, I really, really liked just the pace, because to me, the language that he was bringing out, the pace of it was great. Because, I got a sense, obviously he's reviewing his life, but he gets right into the feature that is most important. And the whole balance of circumstance and temperament, to me, really stood out. But also at the beginning of that is when he talks about the crossing of the Rubicon, which is the all-time famous metaphor of reaching that point of no return, which he does an elegant job of actually walking us through that. And it got me thinking about my own life. And as I'm marching through my own life too, I can see some pathways where I can understand some of what he's talking about. I'm not Mark Twain, I'm not trying to say that, but I definitely like what he's describing around the idea of circumstance and then the temperament of the man. So I want to go back to the crossing of the Rubicon. And first of all, talk about Suetonius. He was a historian. His full name was Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus. What a great name, by the way. If I ever get a Doberman Pinscher, I think I'm going to name him Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, and I'll call him Trank or something when I go running. So that my neighbors will, whatever. It'd be a good way to get in shape. I shave my head. I'm 6'4", so, maybe if I get a tattoo and I run with my Doberman and I run with Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, neighbors will be like, wow, that guy, I don't want to mess with him. So anyway, Suetonius was a Roman historian who wrote during the early imperial era of the Roman Empire. And most important of his many works, the actual surviving works, and they're rumored, and I actually done some reading about him a number of years back, and when I was in college, I'd studied some of the Roman literature at the time. But the surviving work that he's most famous for is a set of biographies for 12 successive Roman rulers, of which Julius Caesar is the predominant and the top of that list. Also, he writes about Domitian, I think is how I pronounced his name. And the book is entitled De Vita Caesarum. And Suetonius describes the event of the crossing of the Rubicon. And I did a little bit of Google searching here to just get some texture. I did read a book about the Rubicon a long time ago, but I'd forgotten some of the context. So let me just offer up some of the things that I found just doing some internet searching here. Julius Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon River was on January 10th in 49 BC, so 49 years before Christ arrives. It precipitated the Roman Civil War, and it crowned Caesar as emperor. Which is a nicer way of saying dictator, because that's really what he was. And it established imperial Rome. And Rome went on a tirade after Caesar took power and really acquired a great deal of land and people and material. Caesar made no qualms about the fact that Rome was going to expand, the mortal universe on Earth. There is the point where he reaches this river, and the line is "the die is cast," which in Latin is "alia iacta est." And as his army is approaching, this was against the wishes of the Senate to have him cross the shallow river into the northern boundary of Italy. The Roman Senate considered it insurrection, treason, and a declaration of war. And Caesar proceeds forth, and so hence the dictator had taken his mantle. And as I'd mentioned just a few moments ago, the metaphor crossing the Rubicon really directly means to pass out of, or the point of no return. I use that all the time. I'm sure, corporate board meetings, we always hear people say, well, I've crossed the Rubicon, or, I used to hear that in school. It's a great phrase, but I don't think a lot of people really realize what was going on there. But Suetonius depicts that Caesar was actually quite undecided as he approached this river, and he attributes the crossing to a supernatural apparition. And this leads to where I got the title, or the idea in my mind was the Unknown Trumpeter, which Mark Twain talks about. This Unknown Trumpeter he sounded the advance with a piercing blast, as Mark Twain writes. Crossed to the other side, as Caesar replied, "Let us go, whether the omens of the gods and the iniquity of our enemies call us. The die is cast. Alia iacta est." And there, by compulsion of the life chain of this unknown man who picked up this trumpet to make this shrieking, blaring sound, he acts like an accident in history. But as Twain depicts in this beautiful letter essay, this man was no accident. This unknown trumpeter was, in fact, quite fixedly right smack in the middle of all of our lives. And quite frankly, he's maybe that one of those key chains that determines our very existence. And I got thinking about the painter Bob Ross, who I love. And, if you're ever stressed out, you can just put on, go on to PBS or wherever The Joy of Painting is aired. I think they still run it on PBS. But you can watch Bob Ross paint those happy little trees. And as we all know, Bob Ross talks about there are no accidents in painting. Everything's got a purpose. And there's a reason why, you used titanium white and Van Dyke brown in these particular moments to make these happy little trees, and maybe possibly not so happy little trees. But what we paint on the canvas, there are no accidents. And in a sense, this is now coming back to what Twain's talking about here. And now I'm going even further back to Suetonius. This unknown trumpeter, whatever the measure of his life was, he plays a very pivotal moment in the life of Caesar and in the empire of Rome and in the history of Rome. Because as the historian Suetonius talks about, Caesar was a bit hesitant to cross. And the reason being is that the Senate, the Roman Senate, had made it very, very clear in unmitigated terms that were he to cross into the northern boundary of Italy, across that shallow river Rubicon, that was insurrection. It was treason. And it would bring with it all of this pain and, whatever. Well, Caesar hears this blaring trumpet. This unknown trumpeter comes in, and it's the impetus that all of a sudden Caesar says, "No, we're going." And alla iacta est, and the die is cast, and Caesar crosses the Rubicon, and the rest is history. And then Mark Twain happens, and you and I are living and breathing because of that. Condensed in the sense, but that's what Mark Twain's talking about there. So now I'm going to jump to another writer I love, which is Charles Dickens. In his wonderful Christmas story, which it's part of our most people's lives every Christmas as Christmas rolls around, is Christmas Carol. And there's a line where Marley, when he first visits Scrooge 7 years after his death on that Christmas Eve evening, to call Scrooge basically to repentance and get him figured out with his life, which he's just tanking miserably. Marley looks at Scrooge as he's hovering above him in the air, and he says, he's talking about life, and his life in particular, Scrooge's life, and what he's doing with it. And he says, "Link by link and yard by yard, our lives take their unknown and appointed times." And time. And now I'm linking back to what Mark Twain says. So the link by link, yard by yard, using Dickens also to go back with Twain here, I thought about this. Twain put it very, very well, where he says we're moving towards the discovery of. And I stopped right there as I wrote this little note. It doesn't matter what that discovery is. We're moving towards the discovery of. You fill in the blank, because that's where we're all headed. We're going to find out what that discovery is for ourselves, and we only know what, or that the things that did happen would not have happened. That their nature and the results are beyond our guessing. That sometimes, and I think most of the time, based on what I'm reading, and certainly got out of this as I was reading this letter from Twain here in 1910, is that it's really not up to us to determine why it is we're in the space we're in. This is where circumstance comes in. It's really up to our temperament and our ability to react in a timely manner to whatever that circumstance presents. And yet we're all like dominoes too. The humanity strain that runs through us from the beginning of time to the end of time, if there ever is going to be an end, I think it's ongoing. It's a domino. effect. And the impact of the unknown trumpeter, whether it's inside of our own hearts, or if we are an unknown trumpeter to someone else, or someone is an unknown trumpeter to us, it's on and on and on. And the impact and the influence and really the role that we play, even if we feel like we're a complete unknown or a nobody, which, I feel like that all the time. Who am I? I'm Russell Cordell Staker. Nobody knows who I am. Doesn't matter. And yet I might actually do something as an unknown trumpeter, hopefully for a positive effect, that gets somebody to cross their own Rubicon. I'm not saying insurrection or treason, which, by the way, that's certainly an issue right now in America. We're hearing whatever. There's a misunderstanding of that. I'm not going to get into that one right now. But the point is that we could be that trumpeter that does something quite engaging and influences a big domino effect in another way that's going to influence somebody all the way down the line. So now I'm kind of getting off here, but let me bring this back. So Mark Twain talks about, he says, to me, the most important feature of my life is its literary feature. Now, me personally, of course, that immediately rings a huge bell because I'm like, yeah, I feel the same way. Samuel Clemens, me too, man. I feel the same way. And he talks about this long road, which I personally understand. I'm still on this road to nowhere. Some days I wake up and I'm like, dude, you are going nowhere with this stuff. Why are you even trying to do this? Nobody cares. But it fulfills me. And I'm taking that long road because it's the one feature in my life, that literary feature, that really counts. Everything else just kind of pales in comparison in terms of just my motion. I'm not talking about my family. I'm not talking about the relationships that are important to me in this life. I'm talking about what motivates me as a man, what gets me focused and excited about the idea of living. And it's the literary feature that Mark Twain talked about. And he said, I did not know what its goal was or even that it had one. I was indifferent, but I was also contented. And that's so brilliantly refreshing. And in its own refreshment, then he takes this illustrious, grand sense of himself as he's reviewing his life and pinpointing that feature that's most important. But as Twain can do so brilliantly, he takes it back down a notch. And he says, the guidance and dictatorship of circumstance. Maybe I don't know if he's making a direct parallel to Caesar as a dictator, but I like that. There was some symmetry and there's a parallel. He says, no, I was the only one. There were other fools there, shoals and shoals of them, but they were not of my kind. I was the only one of my kind. And that to me is just, that shows a great deal of intelligence, emotional intelligence on his part, but great humility, even as he's using this nuance and irony that I talked about earlier, to pinpoint the fact that even at this point in his life, he knows he's Mark Twain. He's very successful. He pissed a lot of money away in his life. Mark Twain was at various points in his life was quite wealthy because he was a very popular writer, but he was imprecise in some of his own financial dealings, and he squandered money, and he was a very complex individual, but so he knew who he was. And in knowing that, he's still, in reviewing this, he's able to still keep his finger on the fact that he didn't see himself as he knew he was in this last state. And, I'm adding here, I'm kind of expanding on this, but what it tells me more than anything else is that he never let himself get ahead of himself because he recognized that the circumstance of his life was always the dictator of that. And he guided himself through the temperament that allowed him to be who he was with that fine feature of his, which was his literary life. Circumstances, he described, it's powerful, but it cannot work alone. And as he described, it has a partner. And in this case, as I mentioned, and as he brings up in his writing, is temperament. The only other partner that a man has is his temperament. It's his natural disposition. It's born in him. It has, the man has no authority over the temperament. I don't know that I fully agree with, he said that something to the effect that the man can't control it or maybe change some of its ways. He does touch on it. There are things that he can do to change his disposition. He talks about a man still an ass if he's an ass. He may be a mule for a while, but he's an ass. I do think that men have the capability of molding their temperament and maybe molding it in a permanent way for the better. But it takes a lot of practice. And again, back to what Twain's saying, it's the glory we come trailing. And in this case, it's something that counterbalances, but also helps guide what this dictator of circumstance provides. And he says, very well, circumstance furnished the capital, and my temperament told me what to do with it. I really liked what he talked about with Ulysses S. Grant, who, Ulysses S. Grant just in and of himself is another man that I've done a lot of reading about. And then I've read some of the things that he had written as a general. And then he was our 18th United States president. He lived between 1822 and 1885. But I love what Twain pulls out here is that, there was a lot of debate about a particular battle or something along those lines. And Ulysses S. Grant, in responding to, I believe it was reporters, said the enemy usually makes your plans for you. What's really, and so that in and of itself is so true. And the enemy in our lives most of the time is just the passage of time. It's the circumstances of our life. That can be the enemy. It's not that there's a big voodoo guy out there, or there's this group of people that we're trying to avoid. I don't think most Americans, most people in general, they don't really have those kinds of enemies. There are people that really truly believe that, and there are moments that there are enemies. I'm not saying there aren't. But I think in the broader texture of what Twain's really getting at and what I sense here is that the passage of time is our biggest enemy because the plans that we're making, we think we're guiding that. And the fact is the enemy makes the plans for us. We have to adapt to what that is. And in the case of life, Ulysses S. Grant, just as a sidebar here that adds a little texture to what I'm getting at here, he was, in my mind, or in my words, he was a horse whisperer. He was just a tremendous horseman. He was a brilliant war tactician and hero, but he was also a very reluctant politician. And I think that's what made him a great leader. He was a terrible failure in business, and it's been written about quite notoriously. He could not get anything to work for him, but when it came to his temperament, General Grant was one of the best generals we have ever had and will ever have. And I mean that even in a broad world texture as well. I'm going beyond just the United States here. He had the temperament to match whatever circumstance came because he had wit, wisdom, and also a reluctance and emotional intelligence and an ability to be circumspect that I think a lot of other faux leaders spend their time trying to be, and they're just not equipped to handle the circumstances of life. And one other thing about Grant that's really it's not as known in our own history, and we should just rediscover Ulysses S. Grant, is that he actually created the Department of Justice, and he crushed the Ku Klux Klan. Thank God for that. Now, of course, that was then. We all know with what's going on in America, white supremacy has reared and has always basically been around, but it's back and it's worse than ever. It's like the lights are on. But it's good to know that we've had leaders in our country that actually saw, even in those earlier days. And of course, slavery goes way, way back. That's the original sin of America. Throughout the history of America, we've had very good men and women who have been white, who have recognized how horrible that is, how wrong it is. And they've done everything in their power to provide a more perfect union, to bring people of every color, class, race together where we as true Americans work together. And that was something that really just impressed me as I was doing some research on him. He appointed African Americans and Jewish Americans to prominent federal offices. And those are just two examples of peoples that he included at a time when others wanted to exclude. And it's a good example for us even in today's contemporary moment in 2021 with what we've been seeing. It's just, like I said, it's not that it wasn't there. It's just that some people have turned on some lights and revealed to us how bad it really is, how bad the rot is in America. And it's nice to know in a historical context that there have always been calm temperaments that are broad enough to lead us into a place where we can be more inclusive, but also really go against the forces of darkness and evil that are trying to separate people from each other. And that's, I think, the big message of America is we have to come together. As a nation combined, as a nation united, we are so much stronger, and the human race benefits as a result of the example that we have been at times. We're currently going through a moment where we're obviously showing we've got some major problems, but I do believe in the broader perspective of America, and I think we will rise above this, but we've got our hands full with some things that have to be worked out. So now I'm getting off, and I want to go ahead and conclude where I'm going with this and why this was so important to me with Mark Twain. As I titled this is The Unknown Trumpeter, and I believe that inside each of us there is a force of discovery on our own paths and viewpoint that is a catalyst not only for ourselves, but for the others that we meet along the way during the course of our lifetime. And that catalyst is to be a force for good, to be a voice of reason, to show irony and nuance in the history that we allow ourselves to continue to learn and rediscover anew, as well as the history of our own lives as we're living it. Earlier in the podcast, as I was talking about it, there was a quote, and I wish I could find it. It talked about the mists of our imagination, I can't remember exact words, but I think that's one of the. If there is a sin, I'm not a big. I'm going to go ahead and express something here. I don't like the idea of sin, in the sense that there is a word called a sin. I don't know that there is a true label that we can give something that says, oh, that's a sin. If there is a sin, it's that we're blind to what truly is right and what truly is wrong. And sometimes we mislabel that. So I know I'm saying this poorly. The point I'm trying to make here is that the unknown trumpeter inside of us awakens that goodness, that force for good, to rise above the stuff that blinds us to the aspects of our humanity that we're not allowing ourselves to see. So that's what I'm trying to say. I do believe that we commit sins. I believe there is right, and I do believe there's wrong. And in between that, there are varying degrees of gray. There's a fuzzy logic that goes on. My dad used to say that all the time. And the circumstance of our particular lives, the histories that we live, and the education that we give ourselves, I'm not talking about formal school here, but the education of humanity, allows for a power of discernment, and at the same time also an ability to go through that fuzzy logic and that gray to see clearly where we need to reach out and be a force for good, not only for ourselves, for our families, but for those around us. We have to be a light. And when we're not a light, it's because we've blinded ourselves to circumstances that take away from the temperament that can guide us. Now, as Mark Twain suggested, now I'm taking some liberty here, the temperament that we come with is what we come with, but it's on us to recognize what those strengths are and to use it in a positive way. And this was actually the line, so as I'm talking, but as we gaze back through the inflating mists of our imagination, it looks as big as the orbit of Neptune. And that's a positive and a negative. We have a sense as human beings to inflate who we thought we were, who we think we are, who we imagine ourselves to be. And if we can take the inflated part out and just see it as it is, then the mists that I think he's describing, those go by the wayside. And I think we're finally in a place to, rather than point the finger and say you sinned or you did something wrong or I'm doing something wrong, we look at each other and say, this is how I can help. And instead of maybe, and now I'm taking a step here, but being a trumpeter, not to get somebody to cross a Rubicon that is going to get them into the lights of insurrection or wrong-mindedness or maybe revolution for the wrong reasons. It's to change the things that are inhibiting human beings from being who they should be to help other human beings to be who they can be. And again, this is back to that chain, the link upon link, the yard by yard, and why Mark Twain said that he got into the literary life because he got the measles at 12. So again, I'm kind of rounding that out, but that's really what I thought about. I'm going to use a little personal anecdote here to close this this production for tonight. When I was a little boy, I probably was about 10. My first true camp out, and I was in the Boy Scouts, was my dad and a couple of the other dads in this little troop that we were in. I was living in Caldwell, Idaho, and they took us on a little, maybe it was a 2-night overnight. I know it was definitely one night, but it might have been 2 nights, but it was a little place in Idaho, and I hope I remember it correctly, but I think in my memory it was called Roby Creek. I have no idea where that was at. I probably should have Googled that before I got on this, but we did a camp out at this place called Roby Creek, and it was a really great camp out. It was a lot of fun. It was the first time I'd really gone out and camped with other boys, and I was with my dad too. My dad was one of the leaders, and we set up camp in this really perfect little place. There was a little bubbling little brook. I mean, it was like everything I would have thought and what I was reading about in the Louis L'Amour stories where, cowboys set up camp at night and cook their beans and sleep on, their bedroll with their 30-30 rifle, Remington, under their bedroll pillow or whatever. It was all of that. And I remember one of the dads showed up at this camp out with a big pistol. It was a silver pistol. I think it was a 44, but it was a long barrel 44 caliber handgun. And it was beautiful. And of course, a kid at the age of 10, you see something like that, you're like, man, I want to shoot that. Let's check that thing out. I mean, if I would have gotten a hold of that pistol, it probably would have knocked me on my backside. But we were on this little hike, and this guy had this thing strapped on his leg because it was huge. And the dad, I can see his face. I remember his name. I'm not going to say his name just in case, but nice guy. But anyway, I'll never forget. He was just this little kind of, diminutive man with a greasy little mustache, and he twisted at the ends. He looked like a bartender back in the old saloon days. But he had this big pistol on the side of his pants, and he had it strapped down at the end of the nose onto his thigh, straight out of like some Western saloon thing. And I was just enamored with that. I was like, this is cool. When I get older, that's what I'm going to do. We're walking on this path, and sure enough, there's a rattlesnake, and this rattler just, and we all froze. And I'll never forget this dad, it's a church group kind of thing. We're on this thing, and he says, stand back, I'm going to shoot that motherfucker. And he pulled the handgun out. And of course, we're stunned because the way he talked, I'd never heard this guy say anything like that. Pulls this thing out and lets fly on this gun. And it was just like the gun went off, and I don't even remember hearing the sound. It was just, I mean, my ears were completely like blown. I couldn't hear anything else. And that snake disappeared. I mean, there was just a dust speck, and it was gone. And, he holstered the pistol, and then we got on with the hike. And, honestly, I don't remember much else about that camp other than we had a great time. And when it was all said and done and we got home, and I remember we're sitting I was in the driveway, and everybody, we went back to my house because that was kind of like where all the boys met up, and their parents came to my house to pick their boys up. And, the dads that brought their boys, of course, they took them home. And I remember standing there, my ears were still ringing like 2 days after because of that thing, but it was so exhilarating. And it was like a trumpet in my mind where I thought, I want to describe that sound someday. And I'm going to tell a story about this big adventure. And I was like I said, like 10. And in my mind, I was already formulating this idea that I was going to tell this big epic story about this monumental camp out, and how a rattlesnake almost attacked us, but, this guy brought this amazing weapon and he took it out, and I was a part of that. And, as a kid of 10, of course, there's no real story there. I just told it to you in the space of, the couple minutes that I've described it. But at that time, and this is where that feature of that literary thing that Mark Twain talks about that I've had since I was little, it was burning very, very bright. And I'll never forget, as the last boy left with his dad and drove off, and I watched their car go down the hill. Our house was kind of up on a little bit of a hill, an embankment, and they went out of our driveway and they drove down the road that we lived on. It was Cypress Lane or Cypress Street, I can't remember. Got all the way to the bottom of the street and then turned left and were gone, and nobody else was on the street. And it was one of those days where, it's like at the end of the movie where, the old Western where the wind's going, and in my mind, I could see the credits rolling from this epic experience that I'd had. And this is the point, and maybe I'm making a huge stretch here, but I thought, this is why, for me, the idea of language is so important. And when I read this thing from Mark Twain and what he was describing, the circumstance and the temperament, the experience of the Rubicon that I talked about, even like Ulysses S. Grant. Now, again, I'm talking about what I know now. I didn't know all of that stuff then, but I had a sense for the fact that there is a feeling that drives this memory, even as we're making the memory, that maybe somehow in the literary mind, what I'm experiencing is a continuum of a greater story, and that I'm adding myself unto that in a way that's not only going to enable me to connect better with my fellow human beings, but I can also finally understand why this experience of life and this feature of my life has the capacity to do something for great good. And so I don't know that there's any great conclusion to anything. And maybe this podcast, there will never be any great conclusion. But these are the things that I keep scratching at. And when I read a great piece of literature, and in the sense of what Mark Twain wrote here, I came back to that. It's very interesting because that little story I just shared with you really has nothing to do with anything that Twain was talking about, and yet it has everything to do with it. And it reinvigorated this memory and this sense of not only who I was then, but it took the inflated sense of my own worries and maybe my own dilemmas and the blind spots that I have of my life. And I'm remembering exactly who I am, who I was, and who I have yet to be, in a sense that will have a great capacity for others around me. So it was just really invigorating to read that. And I think if there's any call to action here, it's just that we have to remember that we are unknown trumpeters. We just don't know what impact that sound is that we make. And, the idea that we are always evolving and getting to the end of our life, much like Mark Twain in his review of what was most important to him. I can't imagine all the experiences that he had, but for him in writing that letter to Harper's Bazaar, which became this essay, I think for him, he could have told all kinds of grandiose things, and ultimately he didn't. He gave perspective about circumstance and temperament, but in the context of what one fine feature, which was his life in letters. And that was what was most meaningful for him. And I have to believe that when Mark Twain crossed over, much as I'm going to believe for myself when that time comes that my life ends, that's the one thing I want to take with me. All the other stuff, of course, the relationships, those are vital, but even the relationships are tied to that literary sense of myself, of language, because that's what bonds me to the experience and the value and the love that I have for people, for humanity, for the people I love, for the people I want to love, that I want to better understand, for people of every race and color. I want to defer my own bias because I want to find their language. And as I read other books and read other perspectives, their perspectives not only become more important to me and supersede my own, but they enable me to be a fuller sense of what I think I could potentially be. So I think that would be the encouragement. Just keep that in mind. So that's tonight's production. Before I close out, I want to let you know that I have an essay that I've written, and I'm going to produce here on a podcast in the coming days. I've got some other work I'm working on right now, but that essay is entitled Nuance. So it's been a few episodes before I've actually had an original work that I've written, but I have something that I want to share. So stay tuned. That's coming. And I really appreciate you being a listener. I hope I've said something positive, and I hope in even my own errors of speaking, I've still been at least a positive force, because ultimately that's what I'm trying to be with language, is just a good force and a good guy, good human being. Be kind to everybody out there. If you don't understand somebody's perspective and maybe you don't agree with it, instead of worrying about your own sense, maybe ask them why they think the way they do. And just tell them, you know what, I love you, you're a human being, just help me understand. And I think if we come to that, maybe the little trumpet sound we make in our own heart is a sound of love to somebody else, and it might actually change the world. So until next time, These Small Hours is a great podcast for just airing out some thoughts that I have, and I hope that they've been helpful to you, and I look forward to the next episode. Take care. Have a really good night. Thank you for being with me here in These Small Hours.